Thank you. So my name is Christoph. Like Marcel said, I am a PowerShell MVP. I think DevOps is very relevant to PowerShell because it's all about gluing things up. I used to start out as a developer, developing .NET applications, had to develop tests for it, as well as do CI/CD, and PowerShell was the best tool for me. Later in my career, I changed to the platform side of things, managing an Azure estate, using IAC, and as usual, you had to wire up things. And again, PowerShell was a good tool to help me. PowerShell has come a long way, and tools have changed a bit, especially as there has been PowerShell Core in the last, I think, 3 to 4 years. I've started counting. So we've switched over from traditional tools like ISC to VS Code, and it's been a very, very long path where for a while people have said, well, still use the ISC because the PowerShell extension for VS Code was under development. It took a few years to catch up on a few things. I think now we're at the stage where we're not just parity, now it's also better. So it's worthwhile showing off really how can you make the best use out of it and use VS Code not just as an editor, but actually use it a bit like as a developer, increasing your experience when it comes to debugging, formatting, code analysis, and the like. Let's do a quick survey. Who of you is still using ISC, either part or fully? Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's quite normal. Usually like a third or a quarter. Who has transitioned fully to VS Code? 1, 2. And so I guess the rest of you guys will be trying to see, is this thing for me? I mean, in all seriousness, there's not just the ISC in VS Code. There's JetBrains editors that are quite good. There's other third-party editors like by Ironman Software that are quite good. So showing the VS Code side of things, it's going to be a bit Microsoft opinionated because it's a Microsoft product, but it is open source. So as a bit of an introduction, I usually have this slide, but I thought, well, because everyone talks about ChatGPT and the likes, well, I like to use Bing, which is basically Binging for you, combining the results and showing them for you. So this is actually what Bing thinks who I am. So I do work for Avanade. I'm a group manager, which is kind of like a senior DevOps manager. Interested in PowerShell, naturally. Well, why would I talk about it? And everything DevOps related to it. I've been a Microsoft MVP for 5 years going. So how did it become a Microsoft MVP? I started writing PowerShell code, and I made mistakes. And there's this tool called Script Analyzer that can actually do a bit of code analysis for you. So I started contributing towards it, and I got into it. I was a .NET developer, so I could even submit pull requests for PowerShell itself. And it was just a passion that I had, a bit of a side project. But this is where it's all started and where I'm still very active. So I'm an active contributor. I would probably even say maintainer of Script Analyzer. And this presentation will show a lot of it. You won't see it directly, but behind the scenes, Script Analyzer, the PowerShell linter and formatter will be working very hard in providing the results that you see visually. So it's still a very nice side project that I'm doing. It keeps me very active in terms of development skills and improving the PowerShell tooling set. And we see that very hands-on with the VS Code extension where you don't need to be too technical, but see the results very, very nicely. If you're interested in this kind of topic, you might also consider other talks by Justin Grote. He's quite a recent PowerShell MVP. He's based in the US, so most of the presentations are remote, but he is coming to European-wide events like PSConf. PSConf is happening this year, later in Prague. So if you're interested, check it out. Tickets are still available. Other presentations I recommend are by Tyler Len, of the previous developers of the PowerShell extension for VS Code. And it's just to see different kind of features that are in there where you see, oh, I didn't know you can do this and that. Because with VS Code, a lot of things are a bit hidden. There's no big UI for it. You have to know there's a command or how to make something happen. And then it's usual to just see it in action. So this talk will be very, very demo heavy. I want to show you guys how I'm using it, what are some of the neat things I'm finding, some of the things you might not have seen before. I will very quickly switch to demo. and get away from PowerPoint. So as I mentioned, it is open source. So on the PowerShell organization, you will find the VS Code PowerShell repo, but there's other repos related to it as well. There is the PowerShell editor services, a backend module, and there's PS script analyzer, and they're all wired up together. And the good thing is you don't need to know about the details of those unless you want to make a pull request. But it means it's all bundled into it. When you install a PowerShell extension, it comes with it. In the past, you used to have to install them separately, and the extension used to rely on it. Now it's all bundled. And there's actually two kinds of extension you will find. There is the stable extension at the top in black, and there's the preview extension. The preview extension has become quite stable now, where there's regular updates, but every month the preview merges into stable. So you're not going to be that much far ahead, but still very useful for the newest features. If you want to provide feedback to the team, very, very handy. That can go too wrong. It used to be in a state where it wasn't that stable, but nowadays you can choose between the two as you would expect between, for example, the .NET SDK. So enough talking, demos. How are we using it? So the first demo is templates, commands, integrated terminal demo. So I've opened VS Code here already, and in the terminals we see there's actually two. One is a standard PowerShell terminal. I can always plus add another one. That's nothing special. You might not have one before, but it's just a default that I've got. And it's the second one called PowerShell extension. And if you don't see it immediately, it's maybe because you haven't opened a PowerShell file yet. So the PowerShell extension only activates once you open a file that has the language PowerShell. So that means a PS1, PSM1, or you use the command to set language. So if I'm trying to type something quickly up like a script, and VS Code doesn't know about it yet, so Control-Shift-P, command palette, and I can go select language. Language mode, and I can type PowerShell. And then it knows it's of type PowerShell. And at that point in time, we would see this guy pop up there. So it's a terminal, but this terminal is also used as a backend for the extension. For all the work it's doing, it has to use a PowerShell process. So why is it exposing it to the user? We'll see that very shortly when we do the debugging demo, because you want to intertwine it with the user experience when you do things there, that it reads details from your session, your variables that you've got set up, all the context, so it can provide you more details around that, because otherwise it can only read your code and make some assumptions that it would be very static. This is where the dynamicness is coming in. But the caveat is similar to the ISE terminal. You might sometimes see odd behaviors. If you really want to reproduce something, you might want to use a vanilla terminal and not this one, because the experience might vary in a subtle way because of all the backend operations that are going on. And it can frankly also happen that it crashes. So don't run your production scripts with this terminal. You can, if you ever find that the extension is stuck, you don't see, for example, the squigglies updating as you're writing, which used to be more a thing of the past, but it can still happen occasionally. There is a command to restart the session. So what it does, it's just restarting this terminal here. Also very handy if you just want to wipe your variables. You've tried something out, you want to start from scratch. You don't have to close and reopen. Just use that command. And you see I use it quite often, so it's at the very top actually for me, because there's just multiple use cases to it. So onto debugging. How many of you have debugged the PowerShell script before in terms of attaching a debugger, having breakpoints and stepping through it? Yeah, quite a few. So let me maybe explain the concept first. You can run a script and it runs it top to bottom. Sometimes you want to find out what's happening in the middle. Classic way is you log out, oh, I'm here and this is what it is. And using a debugger means, well, actually, let's stop exactly where we want to inspect the current state. And then you can look at your variables. Anything that is of interest that with PowerShell, You can even execute random commands to see what the behavior would be if you were to do that. Meaning you can kind of develop your scripts on the go because you run it back to the point where you have your variables and you clear your state again. You type out your command, and when you've got them ready, pop them back into the editor. So it can be a bit of an iterative process as well, not just for debugging a script. So what is a breakpoint? So a breakpoint is if I hover to the left, and maybe to make it a little bit bigger, we will see the red ball up here, and I can just click on it, and it becomes permanent. It's very good to see that it's also not opaque. If it was not opaque, it means, if it was opaque, it would mean a breakpoint would not stop at this point in time. This means you've got your settings not correctly set up, which in other languages can be a bit tricky, but it's always worthwhile bearing in mind that it's got this shape and color in terms of fully working. So what that means, if I were to run the script, it would stop exactly at this point in time. I've kept the script very, very simple because I just want to show the concept of it. So how do we debug? At the moment, when you look at my VS Code folder, I've got only settings.json, which I like to check into my repositories so that you get standard formatting and code analysis settings. We'll talk about that a bit later. But there's no launch.json yet. Launch.json is a file that describes the debug configuration. Before we go into that, we can run this script as is just by pressing F5. But, and I will talk about this soon once I've demoed that. For other cases, you want to set up a debug configuration. So this is just a default where you can hit F5. It runs the current script that you've got open. You see it's already on line 2. It's already defined $A. So here I'm using the PowerShell extension terminal. $A prints out 42, meaning I can do dynamic things. I can develop my script, my next line, test it out what the result is, paste it in there, and then do the iteration process. You won't find it in the other terminal. So it's not there. It's only in this one. On the left-hand side, we see all the variables, and it even scopes them, whether it's local, global, etc. So we see the variable here as well. And if you've got objects, you can expand them, go into detail, meaning you don't have to type everything out. It's a bit more of a graphical user interface that you can use here on the left-hand side. You could even add them to a watch list if you want to go through it line by line. Shortcut is F10. You can use the buttons over there as well. So what if you want to proceed or just let it run to the end? F5 again. If there's another breakpoint, it would stop there again. Or if you're in a for each loop and you've got your breakpoint in there, it would keep hitting it repeatedly. You might want to remove the breakpoint to avoid that from happening and make it continue. And that's it. It attaches automatically. We can also, let me attach again, F5. Say we're there and find out, ooh, that's not what we want. We don't want to execute the next line. We can just do stop, and it will stop current execution, won't do anything else. So it's a nice way out. So I mentioned you might have different behavior. You might use a different PowerShell terminal. You might launch the PowerShell process via a different tool. So this is where the debug configuration is coming in. Maybe your script also just has parameters. And when we press F5, we can't pass any parameters. And this is where launch.json is coming in. So if you go on the left here, run and debug, the one with the little bug symbol in there, create a launch.json file. It shows us different configurations we can use. So the launch script is kind of the current one that we have. Interactive session is probably the most common one you want to do. The interactive session means you're attaching to the process of the PowerShell extension. Meaning in there, if we go there, we see we have it selected. If you press F5 now, or the play button here, notice it shows the menu here at the top, meaning the debugger is attached. So what does that mean? It just means it's listening to the process of this terminal. not doing any magic launching of scripts or whatever, means you're free to do whatever you want. We can launch the script here, any other script where we've placed breakpoints. We could even call other scripts that later call the script and it will hit the breakpoint. And as you see there, it stops there and we can do our inspection work. So it's a nice way where you could pass your parameters to any custom setup. Sometimes you might want to retrieve things and don't just run immediately to check before you're running your script. It allows you to coordinate that, do it in steps. The next one is, like I said, the process is kind of being interfered with by the extension. You want to debug something that is happening only in production, and you want to have a pure PowerShell terminal, like this one here. There is a way to attach to this one as well. So let me see. Because it's all just JSON. You can type here and control space. It shows you the list that we saw before, and I type PowerShell, so it trims it down to a small section. For this one, you want to choose attach to PowerShell host process. So this one will allow me to attach to a specific process ID. So that means I need to identify it. There is luckily a built-in variable, PID, process ID, that's telling me the process ID of this one. If we then start on this one, it's actually already filtering down the processes. And you can see the current one that you can't mistake it. In here, it's actually quite clear, but sometimes you might have multiple processes running. And then you can attach to the process of your preference. With here, the extension terminal here is kind of like halted because it's using it to attach to it. So look it from here, it hits it there. Say we wanted to inspect, we could both ways here. Actually not here. So it's still talking to the process here. The main process that is being debugged is halted by the extension, meaning experience is similar. You still use that terminal here, except whatever you type here. And the hint comes with those arrows. It's coming from somewhere else. It shows the process ID and the run space, which is a PowerShell internal, which makes it very easy. You can debug different processes, etc. And if you dig into VS Code configuration and documentation of VS Code in general, you will find there's all sorts of things you can do with breakpoints. You can have conditions in there where you evaluate something, because quite often you run a for each loop and you want to catch a specific case. We can do that, or add things to the watch list and make it a bit more custom. But this is where I'm going to stop about debugging. Any questions there around debugging? No? Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned something about parameters. Have you parameters in this?
Yeah. So 2 ways. The simplest one, we go to the PowerShell extension again. So I press play. I have to cancel the previous one. So passing parameters. So the first thing is we have to attach it. I think I pressed it twice, but it's got it attached now. So if I want to have a parameter, just let's call it actually $B. So we've got something else. And I want to pass the parameter. Let's call it 43. Now we're in there. So the difference is, instead of launching a script, which doesn't have any parameters because the extension doesn't know what you're going to pass, you can call your script, which doesn't have to be the entry point. It can be the indirect script that ends up later calling wherever you want to end up in your breakpoint. But it means I'm free to type whatever I want in the terminal and pass the parameters like I did in this example. Or maybe you want to set up your parameters, and that is not a static parameter. It's something you dynamically have to compute and run commands to get in there in the first place. So yeah, the long and short is you need your debug configuration, one of those two to attach to it, and then actually initiate it yourself. I think that's the key point. Rather than the default one where you just press F5, no debug configuration. Works for parameterless, but if you've got parameters, then not. It would still run it here because I haven't made it mandatory. But once I put the mandatory attribute on it, it wouldn't be able to run it anymore. That just means a bit more extra effort needed in those cases where the extension can't guess as much how to get into the entry point. Okay, so we have templates, commands, integrated terminal, debugging demo, settings. I'll maybe come to that in a bit when we look at code analysis and formatting. Testing demo. Who's doing testing with PowerShell? Quick hands up. Yeah, we got some people. I presume Pesta? Yeah. So Pesta is a community project, a community test framework that's been developed for PowerShell, and it's become very dominant in the PowerShell space. The PowerShell team tried to push it a couple of years ago by actually shipping it as part of Windows, which they've done, which really helped it get there, so that we don't end up with different competing frameworks, and then it's a bit like the JavaScript world, too many things to choose from. They've reverted a bit back on that. So nowadays, PowerShell Core, the new PowerShell 7, doesn't ship with Pesta anymore. You have to install it yourself, but it's still the most commonly used test framework for that historic reason. So definitely something to check out if you're interested in testing. So this is an example test that I've got here. And we already see the extension annotates it for me, where a describe block is kind of like test scenarios. I could have multiple it blocks where I could do multiple test cases in there. That allows me to run one. And that's quite similar in other test frameworks as well. Sometimes you've got even 3 layers, describe, context, and it, where you go through different assertions. But a very common thing is that you end up accumulating your test scenarios, and you can only run each block individually. And that actually annoyed myself when I was doing testing myself a lot, because I ended up going cd there and then invoke Pesta, or how do I run my script? Well, let me show. I use the context menu, right click on the file editor. Very conveniently, you will find here copy path, and then I used to type in invoke Pesta, copy paste, and then run it. And was a bit tedious, so I thought I could improve it, and that's actually a contribution that I made to the extension as it's open source. So there's a context menu, if you scroll to the very bottom, that allows you to run the whole file, similar to the annotation here. Meaning you don't have to type anything out anymore. I can still go up and rerun it, very easy. You will see it's a bit more complicated in terms of the parameter passing, but the good thing is you can run it and not worry about it. If you've got parameters in your test script, that's another thing. You would still have to revert to the old case, but most test files don't have parameters, or they dynamically fetch them at runtime. This context menu you will also find in the file explorer here. Very, very handy. You can, as it says debug tests, we can place breakpoints in there. As we've seen before, it would stop there. We can inspect, find out why it's not working, run commands, etc. So this is something I always like to show because it's a nice intro how we can run and debug tests. Splitting. So this is a bit more of an advanced concept. So I don't expect most people to have heard of the term splitting. Therefore, I'll explain what it is. Most people will be aware that I can call a commandlet by doing dash parameter and then supplying the path, etc. Splitting is if I'm doing it like this with an @ symbol there. And that means I'm referring to a variable. and that variable needs to be a hash table. So what we're doing in this hash table is having key value pairs for parameters and the value of that. So what's the advantage of that? So first one is readability. I mentioned before it can do formatting. As I'm doing that, it can nicely align it to me centrally on one line. Quite often commands get long. This one, I can go vertically, keep the complexity there. See, I've got multiple command invocations, and one time you're calling it with this parameter, but the rest is all the same. We've been there, we have variables. You still end up with a long line. You want to compare them, it's very difficult. You could do a for each and say, well, I'm just changing one parameter, and this is very easy with hash table because you say, take a copy of it, but change this. There's even syntax that allows you to say, take this, and only for this call, +1 override, say path is something else. So it allows for more dynamic programmability and therefore better code reuse from a parameter point of view. But for me, the main thing that is just outstanding is just the visual aspect of it. You don't end up with those long lines, have it more manageable. And a new feature that I want to demo there that has not been trivial, because as you see, although they're close by, the editor needs to know we're referring to variable, etc. It's not very obvious for the computer to figure that out, but it can do now. And now it can also do tab completion on the parameters there. So not just in the same way how I could, you're probably familiar in the console, type in path and you get that. But it in the hash table there directly now. Removed one of the maintenance nightmares. Once you had it in the splatting format, all nice, but what if you have to modify it? You have to go to the documentation of this thing there or start typing to figure out what kind of parameters do you even have on it. Now you get it there directly. And that's just really highlighting how the extension is moving further and further along. The ISC is far away from being able to do any sort of those sophisticated analysis. Formatting. So I've already started demoing it a little bit. There's different styles, and this is the main setting I want you to have a look at. It's funnily enough, if you go to, let's go back to the terminal actually, and on the PowerShell.code formatting, you will actually find there's loads of them. One is the one you want to look at first. You don't have to look at all those other ones or worry about them, because this is a preset way to define all the other settings in a manner. And if you hover over it, it shows us this GitHub link that's giving some useful examples of how different presets look like. So Alman is very classic C# style, braces on the next line. One brace style is more Linuxy style, meaning braces on the same line. The else is what they call cuddled, meaning it's on the ending brace, which is the main difference to Strustrup, where on the else statement, it's the next line. So those are the three most common use cases, really. You will usually see that developers like to use Alman because it's very similar to C#, new line for everything. And people coming from a Linux background, Python, or even TypeScript as well, they would prefer having it this style. There's no right and wrong, really. For PowerShell, there's a slight preference maybe for the brace on the same line. And that just has to do with the parsing abilities, where sometimes you can't have everything on a new line. But it's up to the user to decide their style, have it consistent. So that's my recommendation. Look at the preset setting, set it, check it into your settings.json in your repository. Because if you want your code to be formatted consistently, and anyone else opening your repo, you want them to use that style. And if you check that into your settings.json, it means it overrides any user settings. So sometimes people say, well, it's not good to check in stuff. Everything in your .vs Code folder, although it has a dot, which quite often we don't like to check in things with the dot, like the .terraform or .git folder. .vs Code is different. You're actually meant to check it in so that for your repository, you can define your standards. Anyone who opens it will get those settings aligned and overridden, because you want to have consistency across your contributors. So like I mentioned, this is a meta setting that goes over all those individual settings. And I'm not going to go in detail, but as you can imagine from the names, it tells me is a new line after a closed brace or after an open brace, and then the collection of them is this standard, which equally means you want to have something that doesn't fit in there, go wild. You've got all those 20 settings to combine them in any shape or form to make it your custom setting. Check it into settings.json, done. Then the next thing, as you can see, this is my personal profile in there. There's a couple of settings in there where I say, this makes your experience different. I talk about unleashing the power of the PowerShell extension, because all those settings you're seeing there, they're not default settings. Some of those are for performance reasons or historic reasons, or the PowerShell team wants the behavior to be closer aligned to the ISC. So it's easy for people to switch over, and as they become more advanced, they turn more things on. And as it's just settings, quite often people aren't aware of it, and it can actually really make a big difference. So let's look at them. The first one is autocorrect aliases. So an alias, let me maybe explain that, is a commandlet alias. Get child item as an alias called GCI. LS is probably the most well-known alias for get child item. And there's many reasons to not use aliases. So different availability between PowerShell versions. They trimmed some of them in PowerShell 7 or the core version. Because when it became cross-platform, suddenly there were things like curl that used to go to invoke web request, and that's the first things where they tripped on other people's feet, and they didn't like that, so it had to be removed on Windows and on Linux. So now there's a bit of a wild mix of some aliases available on some versions, some only on some platforms. So the LS alias is still there on Windows, but not on Linux, because they're on the Linux side, it's a native binary. And long and short is you want to have it well defined. Are you calling a binary? Are you calling a PowerShell commandlet? Aliases are still very good for interactive usage. You want to quickly write your script, use them, go wild. But once it comes to checking into your code, and someone else may be running your script and you want them to have a successful run, please use the right commandlet. So the way we can do that, we see the light bulb coming up. So I could click on it, say, replace GCI with get child item, or we look at the documentation of PS Script Analyzer, which if I do on it, goes now to Learn at Microsoft. It used to be on GitHub, now it's all migrated to the proper doc sites. And once I'm happy with the corrected fix, in this case, quite easy, get child item. But what if you've just spent an hour quickly typing things up and you don't want to go through it, click, click, click? Well, you can just format it. You can either Control-Shift-P, my command palette, the whole thing. So this applies any sort of syntactical formatting in terms of indentation, etc. But with this other setting, it also can replace aliases, meaning I'm done coding. I just want you as the editor, please clean the screen up, the script up, so that I don't have to do that manually. So I could either do it for the whole document or just the selection as I'm doing it there, because I want to demo more of the formatting things. So you can see it before now. And that allows you to do that replacement. So very, very easy and very nice. Using correct casing, another common one. Quite often, you know your commandlet names, you start typing them out. And while it does work the same way, PowerShell is case insensitive, but doesn't the top one localizer format fixes it for you? You don't have to do it individually and then spend all the time. Do it once you're done. I still recommend using source control because it is software. It can go wrong. So maybe have a check-in of this is what was working, that's what I've run. Run the formatter. Just look at the diff. Is there anything that is suspicious? If your syntax is off, then the formatter might screw up. So that's a common use case actually. Because the PowerShell parser is quite lenient on errors. It allows to go further, and then you can have odd things happening that it removes part of your code. You don't want that to happen by accident. The press and the demo, so if we just look at this one here and format it, it corrects me the brace. Pipeline indentation is a relatively new one that I've added a year or two ago, and it allows you for different styles. So it's not on by default. You can enable it. So one style is one indentation per layer, or the other style is just on the next line. So the idea is to treat pipelines a bit like braces, because we're kind of thinking of a new level. Quite often we do a for each, and then the pipeline is used as the delivery vehicle for the next operation. So that's something that can make you look prettier and more readable as you're doing complex operations. Simple formatting things on the next one. Those are some of the non-default settings as well. Is tidying up space between your pipes, or you just type and you use more spaces. Cleans it up for you. All gone now. Similar as well with the braces. Use correct casing I've actually already demoed. Let's see what we have there. The white space between parameters, that's the space cleanup, pipeline indentation style. Use constant strings. That's another good one. So let's see. Does anyone know the difference between the first and the second string here? Yeah. Yeah, that's correct. That's correct, yeah. And there's two use cases, like you said, interpolation. I could interpolate my process ID, or in this case, sometimes you might want to use this syntax to correctly have it. And you maybe don't want things there by accident. You might copy paste something in there. You might have special characters in there, like $signs, and you don't want that to be screwed up. So this is when you use constant ones. And the PowerShell extension can actually figure out in a string, is the string supposed to be a constant or not? And then it can correct it for you. So if we were to look at the string there and format it, format it to a constant string. If I was to look there and run formatter, it doesn't touch it. So this is probably the best demo or explanation around the use constant strings, which is saying, as a best practice, if we don't do any interpolation, just use the fixed one so that no unexpected behavior is happening. And it's shorter as well, and it makes the intent clearer. I'm not meant to do something with the string later. We're done, this is fixed. Some people might think it affects the performance a little bit, because PowerShell is very dynamic, and it's kind of PowerShell is a weird hybrid in terms of when people talk about interpret languages versus compiled languages. When PowerShell is running, it's running in interpreter mode by default, meaning it interprets the line and runs it. But when we've got for loops, it actually compiles behind the scenes. And once it's finished compiling, it can switch over to compiled version. So it's kind of like a hybrid. And in those scenarios, it's maybe where you see some performance enhancements. But because all the work is happening behind the scenes, in most scenarios, you won't see a performance impact. So it's more on your code style that you want to have this settings optimization there. That concludes formatting, and then I would talk about code analysis. Before we move over there, any questions around formatting? Yeah.
What about splitting? About splitting?
So it does format you the hash table. in the sense that, let me go back. Yeah.
Because since you can have any command
It's based on it can wire it up that params is here. So if I, so there's some assumptions, it goes to the next command here. If I was to replace here in invoke rest method, swap them around, you will see the other parameters coming up. So it's a bit simple in terms it looks at the next command that it's using. There's always some assumptions you have to make because PowerShell is dynamic, but yeah, it does look at the next command that is using the same variable, but it has to be this variable. If I was to call this rest params, then we should get back to the original params. Right now, so it does still does the proper lookup of the variable, but it's the next call that's using that. But it allows at least some way of modifying the splatting. Analysis. So we've already seen the squiggly for aliases, and there's actually much more that we can do and get one done. So an example that I'd like to show is one of the settings that one of the code analysis warnings that I contributed to are the following two. So the first one was me being a C# developer switching between languages. And then, yeah, we just used greater sign and equal sign. PowerShell, everyone knows there's that -gt, but it's so easy to forget such an easy human error. And it wants us there when we use it inside an expression like an if. It says, are you sure you did mean to use that? Because how often do you redirect something inside an if expression? Some people do it by design. They want to pipe something away, pipe it to null, and just redirect it. But it is there to tell you, are you sure? And you can suppress that if you say, well, yeah, I'm definitely doing that. But the other one that I did for equal is not showing up. So why is that? So the extension only runs around, I think 12 rules by default. Script analyzer in total has around 50 rules. And of those 50, there's probably 35 that are code analysis rules, not formatting rules. And the reasons for that is more not scaring the user too much, showing squigglies everywhere, as well as reducing the computational demand, because it does take time to do the analysis. Not all analysis is purely static. There's quite often a lookup needed that actually needs to run a command inside the PowerShell terminal. That sometimes means there's lots of resources used behind the scenes. If you ever open a big PowerShell script, let's say 1,000 lines the first time, look at your CPU, it will be going 100% for the first 5 seconds because it's doing all that analysis. So by not running all rules, you can make that behavior better. But equal means you don't get the full analysis. So how can we get the full analysis? So we could be using PS Script Analyzer, which you can install as a separate module, install -module PS Script Analyzer, and then you run invoke -script analyzer -path, and then you run, and then it tells you about those things. Not as nice to read because you get the lines, etc. You want to use it more natively inside the editor. So what you can do is define a settings file. And if you define it in a certain way, in the sense of naming, call it PS Script Analyzer settings.psd1, it will pick it up automatically. That concept is called convention over configuration. There is a specific setting where we could point the extension to this file, but we can just name it like that and it will pick it up. There's a bit of a limit to how much it can pick it up. if I just rename it and it's there, and we check there, and sometimes to invoke it, sometimes you have to type a little bit, we see it's not picking it up, because usually on startup it checks if the file is there, it doesn't always recheck. We can change the content of the file, but it doesn't know suddenly a file has appeared. So again, the restart one is quite a handy one, because now it will check is there a settings file in there, and it checks for the root of the workspace. And it should find it. And if I just start typing to trigger a bit of analysis to happen. Come on. Yay. We now see a squiggly there. It's a slightly different color because it's more informational, not warning. But it means we're running more analysis. We will get more squigglies in general. And therefore, you can have a more thorough analysis. But like I said, it's a bit of a trade-off. Your machine might be running hotter. Depends really on how long your scripts are, because it analyzes the whole script. As you type, it reanalyzes. If you've got really long ones, you might want to put this into your CI/CD pipeline to run it, or run it as a one-off. But actually, most people are fine just having that. So if we look at the content, how did I make it run all of them? Well, it's actually quite simple. The format is a hash table. If you just have an empty hash table, it's its way of telling what just run everything that you know about. We can customize it further. I've got other examples to show where, for example, if we look at this one, let me see, now I actually do have one here next to it. We can customize some rules saying, well, I actually like to use CD a lot, so let's add CD to the allow list. And we can customize it further and further so that sometimes you might not want to suppress the warning. You just want to customize the rule for that. Suppressions, just to quickly show it, but you will all find it on the PS Script Analyzer doc site, is using those annotations above a param block. And once you have them, you see the squiggly and the right host disappears. But you have to check something into your code to annotate it. You can only do it at the functional level on a param, or sometimes you might have to put a param block right at the top. So you can't be very granular. You can still sometimes specify the variable or the more specific thing to suppress, but it is a code change. It's sometimes good to have it there to say, I understood what it said. I definitely want to do it, and you can supply your reason for it, and then you have it documented in your code. But sometimes you just end up repeatedly suppressing things because you don't care about them. And that's where you can start creating your settings file and further refine your experience as what is most suitable for either yourself or your repository. Just looking at time as we come towards the end, there's much, much more I could show. You can, for example, have custom rules that you can integrate. You can have settings file that tell you about the compatibility of PowerShell. For example, you want to be sure this runs on PowerShell 5 and 7, and it will highlight you with squigglies, this command is not available on 5 or 7 or the other way around, or the parameter, or this built-in variable, etc. So there's much, much more. I encourage you to check out the PSSA demo, PS Script Analyzer 1, is the repo I've been using there. I've been going through a default experience one. The demo one is more sophisticated, where it shows more advanced settings files around compatibility, for example. And you can just go to the demo script and see how it looks like and what it shows you. Just a reminder, open your VS Code folder, the workspace in that individual folder, because then it picks up the settings file. And then you can see what you get there. But yeah, thank you very much for paying attention. Hopefully it was useful. Let me know if there's any things where you want me to dive in more detail, or if you've got a question around something. I could spend hours on this, but yeah, I think I want to keep it brief. I've touched debugging, we've touched formatting, with a bit of a look at code analysis and customization. This is just a starting point where you can get more and more efficient using VS Code. because it does provide you really more of a dev experience in terms of the editor helping you write your code and review your code. And thank you, everyone.